All right, welcome everybody. I hope you all had a decent lunch. We're just gonna get right into it. Bitcoin Wayback Machine. We're gonna kind of examine where we are, where we've been, where we're going. So I guess the first thing I'm going to pose to the panel here is, I think where we are in Bitcoin today is in many ways an echo of where we've been in days past, not just within Bitcoin, but within technology in general and various technological cycles that we've seen. So my question to you guys is, what moments in history do you see that we can look to better inform us about where we currently are and where we may be going?
Awesome. Well, I'll take the first crack at that one. For those of you who don't know me, I am the CEO of Barefoot Mining, but my history is actually in the personal computer industry. For those of you who remember the personal computer company Gateway, I was the chief technical officer there, so I led all the product development in the 90s and early 2000s for that company. And my history in the personal computer market goes back to that, where I was really privileged to be part of the design team of what at least I consider to be the world's first laptop in 1986. And so I got to follow this progression of technology through those optics. And there's an interesting thing that happened in the personal computer industry that mimics something that happened in Bitcoin and that may happen again, or at least an attempt. And that was in 1984, IBM created a computer called the IBM AT. It was the most popular personal computer in the world, and it really created the personal computer revolution. And guys like me and other people started to design what were called clones, which were, knockoffs and copies of it. IBM was the king, though. Even after the first year or two, they had about 2/3 of the market share. But they started to get upset that they didn't have 100%. So in 1987, they tried to hard fork the personal computer and create something called the IBM microchannel architecture. And what it did was it obsoleted all of the hardware that had been put in place in the previous years in the personal computer industry. I remember as a young engineer at that time looking at it first technically and being like super impressed by it and kind of scared, like, hey, is my future in jeopardy? I didn't have a very worldly view at that moment. But over the course of a couple months, the power of the network effect of the old personal computer stuff started to take hold, and they started to get rejected. And the rest of the personal computer industry banded together, and we created something called ESA, which some of you who are PC geeks might now know morphed into PCI. But we maintained that backward compatibility all the way. While that was happening, IBM started losing market share, and about 6 years later had lost 100% of it and exited the personal computer industry. So much like we saw in the block size wars, where there was an attempt to hard fork, this was a precursor to that same sort of thing.
Does anybody want to dive into a little bit about the fork wars, and then whoever wants to dive in?
Actually, I want to bring up on your original question. I think what is funny is the 70s, we had high inflation. And at that time, the only available thing for people to get away from the bond market that was crashing and real estate that was flat or actually crashing, and the stock market that was also flat, but in real term crashing. And so the only thing that was available to them was gold. And so today, the big difference is we're still having high inflation, but now we have Bitcoin, and there's no need for storage fees or relying on a third party, and that's gonna chip into people's mind and how easier it is to protect yourself, basically. And to build on that, to just prove that we are mimicking the 70s in terms of inflation, just look at my wife's pants, for example. She's got those large base pants like this. Can you stand up and show? Yeah. And it's coming back.
So, I mean, they're using the most efficient technology of the time to avoid the debasement. And I mean, we've got something that transcends precious metals. now. Interesting. Matt, I'm curious your thoughts.
Well, while we're on the subject of, I think one of the best templates we can use is thinking about the PC revolution, which we've heard about, and also the internet revolution. And what comes to mind on this subject, which I'm not an expert on, but the protocol wars of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, where people were trying to hash out what communication protocols would be used to build the modern internet that we know of. And there were a couple of competitors. There was the, I can't remember the exact name of the protocol, but this was the one that all the large, as you can imagine, all the large European phone companies wanted. There was one that I think was put forward by IBM as well. And then there was something called TCP/IP, and I think that's the IP is where we get the internet from. That was the protocol, as I understand it, that won. And once it won, it became very clear, certainly in retrospect, that if you're working on new internet protocols at that point, you are completely wasting your time. And I think we're seeing something similar with Bitcoin, where Bitcoin has the monetary network and it has the protocol that's going to drive the global monetary network. So if you're trying to reinvent the rat trap, if you're doing Ethereum or Caspa or Hedera or any of these, you're really like someone in the 90s and you've already been bypassed by TCP/IP and you don't even realize it. So you're sort of doomed to repeat the history that you don't know.
What the heck is X25?
Yeah. Now, one thing also in the same vein of kind of seeing the echoes through history, even within Bitcoin, we've seen certain things repeat. In particular, we've seen FUD repeated, fear, uncertainty, and doubt around certain topics repeated through the cycles even. And I mean, how many people have heard the mining death spiral multiple times? Who's heard of a mining death spiral in years past? Yeah, so that's one that's coming up regularly. Obviously, who's heard worries about Bitcoin can't scale? Who's heard that before? Many. So what I'm curious about with you guys is how much of that FUD continues to be recycled cycle after cycle for the foreseeable future, and what pieces of FUD are perhaps on the cusp of being crushed once and for all?
Regulations. Because when you look at it, the government's going to ban it. I mean, I remember in 2015, gold bugs, that'll be their arguments. Government's going to ban it. And it's just funny that you hear less and less that. I mean, the seizing of Bitcoin from the Silk Road and then auctioning those just give first barrier to this thing that got crushed, to this argument. Well, if the government is actually auctioning it, actually they recognize it as a legitimate asset. And the second thing was things like Cyprus Bank's bail-in actually legitimize this as a way to avoid this. And the SEC lawsuit against Ripple and XRP, everybody realized, the SEC is not going to be suing the CEO of Bitcoin. I mean, he's doing fine, right? The CEO of Bitcoin? Yeah.
He's unavailable for comment. What about you guys? Do you think there's FUD that's going to endure versus being crushed in the near term?
I think the FUD that will endure and will escalate, because you have to understand FUD is the people who push FUD. You can never answer them. There's no way to ever silence it. They're not interested in logic. The Peter Schiffs of the world, the Greenpeaces, and the Chris Larsons of the world. So what I expect to escalate is state-sponsored FUD. And state-sponsored FUD will be with us until Bitcoin demonetizes the state, and this will be a relief when that happens. But the kind of FUD I would expect to see in the coming years would be, especially in the current macro context, would be accusations that Bitcoiners are hoarders, for example. This was the accusation made against holders of gold in 1933 by FDR. It's always the accusation that happens. It's what happened in the Weimar Republic as well. And I think what So I think this is going to be the kind of state-sponsored, weaponized FUD, and you'll see things like Bitcoiners are responsible for inflation, these kind of new kinds of attacks that we haven't seen. So it's really, predicting FUD is difficult. I hope the pizza FUD goes away, that Bitcoin's not scarce because you can divide it into lots of pieces. Dumb FUD will go away. State-sponsored FUD, I'm extremely worried about because they're not interested in debate. It's just going to be used to put people in prison.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think the state-sponsored FUD is going to be the biggest thing to contend with. As a miner, I think a lot of it's been directed at us in the mining community. I don't expect that to dissipate for a while. But I do think the argument's getting harder on two vectors. One vector is, I'm sure everybody in this room has seen at least some statistics, but we are the greenest industry in the world. And the use of renewables by our community and the impetus from our community to further develop that is, I think, a fundamental asset in Bitcoin's cap. However, I think there's a second piece that hasn't been, let's say, completely blown out yet, and part of it goes back because this is a way back machine. If you read the early works of Satoshi, check out Phil's book. You'll see him talk about proof of workers. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, but I'm not sure he ever uses the word miner, or maybe at the very end a little bit. But
I don't remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So he may not even have ever used the word miner, and so his concept was of the miner and the node actually being the same. It was later on that those two things separated.
I think that the concept of miner was come up as a way to make things easier for the general population to understand what's going on.
Yeah, but he called them proof of workers, and it was the combination of the miner and the node. And I think you're starting to see some movements within the community on the development side for maybe that original vision to start coming back. In fact, Phil and I were talking up on stage a little about this before, as we were getting ready, that vision of basically everybody having a proof of worker in their home that is both a miner and a node, I think is really noble. And when people think about the mining industry, we're sponsored by Marathon. I appreciate the efforts, but the big miners represent about 25% of the hash power. The public miners represent about 25% of the hash power. If you haven't studied, that's a lot smaller number than you might guess. The smaller commercial miners like myself and the home miners still make up a phenomenal percentage of the hash rate. And I think we're stronger as a network with that being the case. And the reason I'm bringing this up in this FUD conversation, though, is as that becomes embodied, as we have tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands and millions of people running proof of workers in their home, it'll get hard for state-sponsored FUD to attack mining because everybody's doing it.
What about scaling FUD? When does that go away? Because that's been repeated a lot too. Like we've gotten very efficient on chain by doing a number of things. Number one, the throughput on chain with SegWit added some capacity. We also started actively being more efficient with the way we use Bitcoin. Exchanges weren't batching transactions, then fees hit massive highs in 2017, and now every exchange batches transactions because they're monetarily incentivized to. And then Lightning didn't even exist in that run, and then the first experimentation and individuals being able to use Lightning at all was 2018, and it wasn't even really accessible as just a mobile app without not having to do channels or anything until the last maybe couple of years. But we still see repeated FUD over the years of Bitcoin can't scale, it scales a little bit, we add Lightning, Lightning can't scale, you can't onboard everybody to Lightning. We're seeing all of these different things pop up, but does that go away? And the parallel that I want to draw here is the internet, and this is kind of a throwback to an old talk of Andreas Antonopoulos, but he said that Bitcoin will continue to scale ungracefully. We're going to bump into these walls and then come up with solutions to mount them and surpass them. So at what point do we have the same attitude about Bitcoin as we do about the internet? I'm not super worried about the internet scaling because I can do everything I need to do on the internet. When do we hit that point?
I think people should look up, if you go back in time, you mentioned before Lightning Network, nobody could conceive a layer 2. And actually, if you look back in 2006 or 5, nobody could even conceive of a decentralized digital currency. So we're hitting those things and wow, there's something that's amazing. And one thing that's amazing too, it is in development, it's early, it's a coin pool. And that's actually, can attach to Lightning Network and all that. It's in its infancy, but I asked Tejas Drija what he thought about that. He liked the idea, but I think they need to improve those things. But that will change. It'll make things even more like highway. Kind of think of it. We're going to get even more better infrastructure on layer 2 that people will say, oh, people were using layer 1 before. That will be eventually in 10 or 20 years what people will say.
Yeah, I agree. In years from now, we'll have people amazed that somebody they know did an on-chain transaction. Like that may be an eventual future. We're getting down to the wire here. We got a few minutes left. There's one last little segue I wanted to do here. One thing that hasn't been an echo, one thing that's been changing in Bitcoin over the years is the type of people being attracted to Bitcoin. So it started with its cypherpunk roots. That was very appealing to kind of the libertarian crowd, brought them in, the Austrian economists. Then we had kind of, it tended to lean very kind of right politically for a while, but now we also have a new cohort of progressive Bitcoiners coming in as well. So my question here in and around the types of people around Bitcoin, right now, regardless that we've got a wide range of people here, we still kind of have a cohesive goal. We believe that sound money is useful for all of us. Gigi wrote his book, 21 Lessons, and he has one of the lessons is, you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you. Does that hold true with a planet of 8 billion people onboarding to Bitcoin who may be very set in their ways? Do they adapt to Bitcoin's immutability, or do they stomp their feet in the stand and build a competing, even if doomed to fail, alternative? Where are we headed?
You want to start, Matt?
Well, I think we're already seeing competing systems. For example, this new BRICS currency that's going to try to use shiny yellow rocks, and they haven't learned anything from history. There are going to be settlement problems. The Chinese and the Russians and the South Americans, there's all these cultural differences. So there will be competing systems, but they will fail miserably. I think in terms of hyper-Bitcoinization and a global population using Bitcoin, I think it's a and this question of Bitcoin's immutability, it's probably a spurious quote by Thomas Jefferson that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. And I would expand that to say eternal vigilance is the price of freedom money as well. And so this is a fight that everyone is going to have till the end of their lives, and it's going to go on for centuries, fighting to try to keep this protocol in a fairly simple form at the base layer and not try to complicate it. I've used this metaphor of a Swiss Army knife versus a sword, or I probably should have said a shield in that video. But I think a template would be, for example, the U.S. Constitution and the Founding Fathers, which I often think of as another way of approaching this. And they set up a very robust system, probably one of the most interesting systems that's ever been set up. But unfortunately, we've seen what can happen even when you have a very strong protocol like the U.S. Constitution and you have this state system and you have this balance of powers. It can be corrupted simply because we're all human beings. And so I think this is a fight that never ends.
Bob, you got 1 minute.
All right, I'll do my best. I think it's important for people here, who I believe mostly are Americans or Canadians, to change your perspective sometimes and look at Bitcoin through the optics of somebody in Argentina or Lebanon or Turkey. Because while I do agree, Ben, like things like the progressive case for Bitcoiners are important, when you live in places like that, you're not left or right, you're in survival mode. And Bitcoin's your lifeline. And so what excites me is that we have this massive group of people who the value proposition of Bitcoin is very apparent. We just have to get it to them. They will get it a lot faster than those of us sitting in this room.
So when you look at Bitcoin Cash and the problem that they had, just trying to increase the block size and how it failed, just shows us that if actually some clowns wants to increase, 21 million Bitcoin, that's not enough. We need 40 million, or we need to bail out banks XYZ with 41 million Bitcoin. That's not going to take. I mean, if just increasing the block size didn't work, just imagine anything more serious.
Yeah. So I'll finish this off by saying, everybody in this room, you are the first, last, and only line of defense for these generations of monetary war that we're facing. You are the ones that protect Bitcoin and keep it sacred. So secure your keys, run your nodes, and learn your privacy. Thank you guys very much.